In this lesson, we're continuing with solving, but we'll be solving literal equations. A literal equation is an equation that has mostly letters. Formulas are examples of literal equations. So solving a literal equation is just like solving a formula for one of the variables or letters that you see there. In example 1, you see the formula for volume of a rectangular prism, which is length times width times height, and we're going to solve for L. So since we're solving for L, you would want to ask yourself, what are they doing to L? And when you solve, you always undo by doing the opposite. So right now they're multiplying the length times the width and the height. The opposite of multiplying would be to divide. So instead of multiplying W and H, we would divide W and H to get L by itself. And remember, whatever you do to one side, you have to do to the other. So now L is by itself, and it would equal the volume over the width and height. On question 2 here, they give the area of a triangle, which is 1/2 times base times height, and we're going to solve for the height. So if we look at the height right now, they're multiplying it times 1/2 the base. I want to undo the 1/2 first. So to undo a fraction, you multiply by the reciprocal. The reciprocal of 1/2 would be 2/1. So I'm going to multiply both sides by 2/1, because what you do to one side, you do to the other. Here, the fractions cancel. 2/1 is the same as 2. So 2 times a would be 2a. And on the right side, we're just left with base times height. Remember, we're solving for the height. So right now, they're multiplying the base. The opposite of multiplying would be to divide by the base. And that'll get the height by itself. Whatever you do to one side, you do to another. So 2a over b equals the height. In other words, to get your height or your h, you would multiply 2 times the area and divide by b. The next example here is for perimeter of a rectangle. We have 2 length plus 2 width, and we're solving for the width. So right now, if we look at the width, there's a lot going on that side. So I want to see what's stuck to the width first. Right now it's stuck to the 2w. So I can't get rid of that yet. So I would undo the 2l. The opposite of positive 2l would be minus or negative 2l. And remember, what you do to one side, you do to another. So I'm getting rid of that whole piece, the 2l. P and 2l are not like terms because they're different variables or letters. So you just write it out. P minus 2l equals, and on the right side we're left with positive 2w. So I'm going to go ahead and write this up here. And remember, we're solving for w. So now if you look at w, they're multiplying it by 2. The opposite of multiplying would be to divide by 2. And that'll get w by itself. Remember, what you do to one side, you do to the other. So now that w is by itself, it would equal p minus 2l divided by 2. So they would take the perimeter and subtract 2 times the length and then divide by 2 to get their width. This next formula is for energy. We have E equals mc squared, and we're solving for m. Right now, m's being multiplied by c squared. The opposite of multiplying would be to divide. So instead of times c squared, we can divide c squared. And what you do to one side, you do to another. So E over c squared would equal m. This is a formula for energy. M stands for mass. So in other words, if you wanted to take the mass, you would take your energy and divide it by c squared. The last problem here you should recognize from geometry. When you're finding the midpoint, you add your two x coordinates and then divide by 2 or take half. Same thing with the y's, but here we're focusing on the x coordinate. So we have this formula, x equals 1/2 times x1 plus x2, and we're going to solve for x2. So right now, we look at x2. We need to see what it's stuck to or what they're doing to it first. So right now, the x2 is being added to the x1. So we can't undo the x1 yet because they're stuck together. We would have to undo that 1/2. The opposite of multiplying 1/2 would be to multiply the reciprocal. Remember, the reciprocal 1/2 is 2/1. And what you do to one side, you do to the other. Here our fractions cancel out. Remember, 2/1 is just 2, and 2 times x is 2x. And on the right side, we're left with x1 plus x2. You don't have to put those parentheses anymore because that's all that's left. We're solving for x2. So right now they're adding a positive x1 to an x2. So we want to get it by itself. We would do negative or minus x1. And what you do to one side, you do to the other. These are not like terms because x and x1 are different. So I would just leave it 2x minus x1 equals positive x2. And that would be my answer. So to get one of the coordinates or that you're using to get your midpoint, you would actually take 2 times your midpoint and subtract the x1. So these formulas are very important to be able to solve because later when you take physics or your upper classes, there's a lot of formulas, and if you're able to solve them, it's easier to work out your problems.